Hello, everybody. Good morning. Very happy to see so many people here on Sunday morning. Welcome to the industry session, US Funding Opportunities for Non-American Filmmakers. For the next hour and a half, 2 hours, Tracy Holder will be telling you more about this. So please, a hand of applause for Tracy.
Thanks, Nadine. Good morning, everybody. So nice to see you all. Before we start, I'd like to thank Nadine, who you just met briefly, Steen, and Adrique and their whole team. I mean, they've put together such a stellar program for us here at IDFA, so let's give them a round of applause. I know they've been working like maniacs for the past few months. Anyway, I'm so happy to see you all here on a Sunday morning. It says something about us as filmmakers that this is the best thing we could find to do on a Sunday morning. But I'm hoping that in the course of the next hour and a half, 2 hours, that the information I share with you will help you in funding your films. And so let me start out giving you a sense of how our morning is going to unfold. Oh, and one thing before we start, I will pause at different points to take your questions. I want this to be as participatory as possible. The one thing I would ask of you is that if you can try to make your questions that will serve all of us, like general questions rather than questions that are about your particular projects. So that's my one request. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very, very brief intro of me and my work, some basic principles of fundraising that will apply whether it's for grant funding, whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's individuals, whether it's for broadcasters. We'll then go into finding the right funders, at which point we'll talk about the specific funders in the US who are interested in international projects. And then we will, time permitting, go into the specifics of grant funding and basic principles about how to frame your proposals to put your best foot forward with funders. You know, the American funding model is a very different one than the model here in Europe or outside of the US. It's very specific. We mainly get our funding from grants. And so that is something that isn't traditionally done here or outside of the US. So what I'm hoping to do is help explain to you sort of how I go about grant writing, because that's sort of what I spend my time doing, and sort of trying to explain to you what it is that funders are looking for and how to conceptualize grant writing so that when you leave here, what I'm hoping you'll have is sort of a roadmap for how to go forward should you decide that it's a good use of your time to try to apply for US grant funding. Okay, so me. This is a film I did several years ago about a man named Joe Papp. He was the founder of a theater called the Public Theater in New York. He started Free Shakespeare in the Park. He was a social visionary. And many of you may know of him because the play Hamilton, which is a cultural phenomenon in the United States, started at his theater. The film premiered at Tribeca. It will be on PBS American Masters next year. Okay, and then last year, I produced a film originally called Mudflow, now called Grit. And it was just on the POV series recently, and I learned from Nadine this morning that she met the filmmakers a few months ago when they were at the Media That Matters Film Festival. Is that right? Now, one thing I want to tell you that I learned from working with the two women directors I produced this film is that the film is set in Indonesia, and the filmmakers took along a photographer. The photographer, a very successful photographer, wanted to do a photo essay, and the filmmakers agreed that she could go with them as long as she would allow them to use the photos that she took as production stills. And one lesson that I learned, which I'm going to now share with you, is that by having amazing production stills, anytime we got a grant, when the funder was looking to issue a press release announcing the current pool of grantees, or they wanted to put an announcement on their website and they needed an image, it was our photo that they used. So while all the other filmmakers who got the same grant at the same moment were included in a press release or put on the website, it was our photo that was always used. So we got a lot more press than everyone else. We became far more visible in the field. And for me, that was a real lesson about the importance of having good production stills. So that was just, I'm always learning. So just a quick one more word about me. So like you, I'm a filmmaker, but I also work in the industry and I'm on a lot of funding panels. And so one of the things that gives me is a perspective from both sides of the aisle, right? And one thing about the Joe Papp film that I just showed, right? The film is called Joe Papp in 5 Acts, but its alternate title is Joe Papp in 12 Proposals, because maybe 20% of my time was spent filmmaking, 80% of my time was doing the business of filmmaking, which, of course, as you all know firsthand, is fundraising. So mastering grant proposal writing is a skill that has served me well, and I'm hoping by the end of this, I'll make converts out of you as well. I'm currently producing a film, and I'm actually starting a film of my own, but I do a lot of consulting all over the world, and in the United States, I work with filmmakers. I do a lot of pitch training and other kinds of things. So I have raised over 2.5 million, which I'm sure to most people sounds like a lot of money, but if you were to amortize it over the amount of time it's taken, I'm figuring it's about $1 a day. It's only when you say it in the aggregate that it sounds like a lot. Okay, so this is an article that was in the New York Times. It's a headline from a New York Times article about 3 years ago. And it focuses on how much more difficult it's gotten in recent years to get into the top Ivy League schools in the United States. So this article focused on 3: Stanford, which you see in the photo, Harvard, and I believe it was Yale, like the leading universities in the States where the average rate of acceptance is between 5 and 6%. So for every 100 people who apply, only 5 or 6 get in, right? Long shot. To get a grant from the Sundance Documentary Fund or from Chicken and Egg, a fund for women filmmakers, is between 2 and 4%. It is easier to get into Harvard than it is to get a grant from these funding agencies. Now, I'm not telling you this to make you realize that you should have gone into banking or some other career. I'm telling you this because to know what you're up against means that you can make strategic choices, right? We're all dealing with limited time and capacity, and therefore we have to constantly ask ourselves, is what we're doing a good investment of time? And not every project is a good fit for grant funding. And since the odds are so heavily stacked against us, and it's a significant amount of work to do a grant, one of the things you have to really ask yourself as we're going through this presentation is this a strategically good use of my time and limited resources? Okay, there are 2 basic rules of fundraising. The first is that it is all about relationships. And what I mean by that is when you apply to a grant for grant funding, apply for funding, or when you're here at IDFA meeting with industry people or pitching your film, the film you're producing now, that you're working on now, is hopefully one of an entire body of work that you're going to create over the life of your career. And so while the project you have now may not be a good fit for a funder, perhaps your next project will be. So it's very important that when you are meeting with people, you take a long-term approach, right? And you think about this as getting on people's radar screen and building a network that will serve you over the course of your lifetime, rather than, right, your immediate need, which is to fund the current project. And that's true also when you apply for grants. When you apply for a grant, right, hopefully you've applied to a funder where you have a reason to think that you're a good fit, that you're not just randomly casting out your applications willy-nilly, that you're really being strategic about where you're applying. But even if you apply to a funder and you're not a good fit, if you think about it, it's a very finite pool of funders, and they travel in a circle, right? They're all here at IDFA, they're at all of the major festivals, they know each other. So, for example, if I'm on a funding panel and I see a project that I think is a good fit for Chicken and Egg, I will be telling Chicken and Egg when I next see them, hey, I saw this project. It wasn't right for the panel I was on, but I think it might be a good fit for you. So one of the things that being out in the world and getting your name out there does is it gets you on radar screens and it gets you circulating within the documentary funding community. Okay, the second principle is that people who inspire confidence make good fundraisers. Because one of the things I've noticed, and one of the things I've really come to believe, is if you think about it, if we had the time and we went through this room, and each of you briefly described your project, I bet we would all agree that almost everyone here had a project worth making, worth funding. Right? So there's no dearth of great projects out there. What is sorely missing is a wealth of funding, right? And so when funders are looking at projects, they're not only looking at the ideas, they're investing in you, and part of what they're looking for is, what they want to know is, are you someone who they can feel confident will deliver the project? Right, within a budget, will you be able to raise the rest of the money if they give you, right, no funder is going to give you your full funding. And so they're looking as much at who is the person making this project as the project itself. So that's something to consider, and we'll talk about as we go forward how your proposal can instill confidence in a potential funder. Okay. So far, any questions? Everything clear? Okay, you're all still breathing. That's a good sign. Okay, onwards. Okay, in the US, we have a very particular requirement for grant funding, which is called fiscal sponsorship. Is that a term anyone here knows? No. Okay, one person. Okay. So in the States, it's a tax code thing. You can't, funders are generally considered charitable organizations, right? They're making a donation. It is a charitable contribution to your film. And for that reason, they can't generally give money to individuals. They need to give money to charitable organizations, which in the US are called 501c3s. Since the US government doesn't collect tax from tax-exempt organizations, 501c3s, right, they're not going to make it easy to become a tax-exempt or a nonprofit organization. So most filmmakers cannot afford to become our own nonprofit entities or 501c3s. So what we do is we align ourselves with existing nonprofits, and they extend the umbrella of their tax-exempt status to us to allow us to apply under their name. In exchange, they get a small percentage of any funding that we secure. And that amount of funding is between 5 and maybe 10%. And so one of the first things that you need to do when you're applying for a grant in the US is you need to find a fiscal sponsor. Not every fiscal sponsor takes international projects. One of the fiscal sponsors that's actually here at IDFA is the IDA, the International Documentary Association, and their URL is documentary.org. And fiscal sponsorship is relatively easy to get. If you think about it, right, you do all the work, and then the funder, then if you get funding, the fiscal sponsor gets a cut of the money that you've raised, right? And they consider it an administrative fee, but for them it's free money. So the bar for entry in fiscal sponsorship is rather low, but it is something that almost every single funder requires. A lot of times a funder will say that you don't need it when you apply, but if you get the funding, then you'll have to secure the fiscal sponsorship. And by becoming a fiscal sponsor assumes the legal liability. So when you are applying, it's actually they submit the application, the funding goes to them, they take out their fee, and then they give you the rest. So that's an important thing to know about because that's a requirement for, I'd say, 95% of American funders. Okay, now the part you've all been waiting for. How do you find funders? Who are these funders? So let's now go through them. So one thing that I do strategically when I'm looking for funders is I try to consider other projects that are similar to my film, and I then look at who funded them. So for example, with the Mudflow Grit film, where we saw the photo earlier on, that film was about drilling for natural gas in Indonesia. That's gone terribly wrong. And in the States, we had a film about fracking, which is the term we know it as in the States, drilling for natural gas, that had gone terribly wrong. And the film was called Gasland. I don't know if it was a film that was popular here, but in the States, it had huge success. So the first thing I did as the producer on the film, who's responsible for raising the money, is I was like, well, who funded Josh Fox's film Gasland? So sometimes I'll watch the film, but most of the time I'll just go to the credits at the end. And I'm the only person in the theater who's there, like when the movie is over and everybody's left, I'm sitting there waiting to see the credits at the end because all I want to know is who funded this film. Or I'll go to the website for the project and I will look at who funded them. And then I know two things. I know this is a funder who funds film, and they're interested in this subject. And I actually do the same when I'm looking to create a distribution plan, right? Because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I'm like, where did this film show? Because then I know these are film festivals, these are broadcasters who are interested in this subject. And so that's also a way, that's like my starting place when I'm looking for funding. Then in the States, we have something called the Foundation Center, which is actually, it's like a library. It's a public-private partnership, and you can physically go there if you are lucky enough, as I am, to live in New York. But if you don't live in New York, you can go to their site. It is a repository of every piece of information about every foundation that exists in the United States. Because, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about fiscal sponsorship, nonprofits are, by law, because they're tax exempt, there's certain documentation that they have to make publicly available that sort of provides a window onto what they fund and how much money they have. And the Foundation Center exists to gather all of that public documentation and make it accessible to the public. So online, they have a lot of resources. Most of them are free. Some are by subscription. If you come and visit us in New York, if you're going to come and help us overthrow our current administration, which we would welcome your help doing, I will go with you. I will happily take you down to the Foundation Center. It's a wonderful resource. They recently changed their name to Candid. They partnered with a second nonprofit organization called GuideStar. So it's still under foundationcenter.org, but it's also now under Candid. And that's a great resource if you want to do research about any particular funder. At the same time, their websites are incredible repositories of information. Almost every funder has a list of who they've funded and at what level, right? It's important to know what level they're funding at because generally we want to ask for the most amount of money that they're going to give out because even if we get the grant at the highest level, it's only going to fund a fraction of most of our films. Another fantastically good resource is the Doc Society, which is docsociety.org/resources. They have an incredibly extensive list of funders, and they have both US and international, but they also have great resources when it comes to distribution, on impact campaigns. It's really just an all-round fantastic resource for filmmakers. So I recommend that highly. Okay, so now let's talk about some specific funds in the US. So the top of the list is Catapult. And Catapult is one of the few funders that likes to be early money, right? Most funders don't want to take a risk. They'd like to come in towards the end of the project where it's clear that you're likely going to get over the finish line and complete the project. Catapult, on the other hand, knowing how difficult it is to get early money, was kind enough to say that they wanted to be able to support filmmakers. Basically, their funding is to make your trailer, your fundraising trailer, which, as we all know, is now almost required, whether it's if you're applying for a fund, or if you're applying to a broadcaster, or if you're applying to any kind of training program, right? They want to see the proof of concept. They want to see your visual material. And that's an expense to have to shoot and to then put together a trailer. Catapult will give grants in the range of $5,000 to $20,000. They do require a fiscal sponsor, but you can have that at the end if you do get funded. They are incredibly, it's 3 women in San Francisco. They're wonderful people, and they are one of the few funders who will answer questions. You can reach out to them. Okay, a few other things about Catapult. They don't fund student films. Documentaries must be 28 minutes or longer. They don't fund series. Animation is acceptable. Documentary narrative hybrids will be considered on a case-by-case basis. And let's see, they prefer to fund people who have previous film or television production experience. And if you're a first-time filmmaker, they really encourage you to partner with somebody who has experience. They are really looking for strong, visually strong, character-driven, story-driven films. They don't have to be social issue films, which is not true for every fund in the States, but they really want something that is clearly driven by story rather than issue. I don't know if this is true outside of the States, but in the States, a lot of times we see projects that are issues in search of a film, right? It's driven by a subject or a topic rather than a story. And most of the funders that we're going to talk about today really want your storytelling skills, often storytelling skills that illuminate an issue, but not, something that is driven by issue. Okay, moving on. Sundance, right? I'm guessing everybody in this room knows of Sundance. Sundance funds between 40 and 50 projects a year. They have two tiers of funding. One is development and one is production and post-production. So one thing I want to clarify, one thing that I think is confusing is the term development. So often when I'm on a funding panel, I will see a project that is more of a theory, like somebody has they've just given birth to an idea, but they haven't really developed a film. They don't yet know the narrative arc. They don't yet know who their characters are. They just have an idea that they're passionate about. And they think, well, development, right? I'll get money and then I'll develop the idea. And development is actually a misleading term because that's not what development means to funders. What development means to a funder is that you have an idea that you've really developed. You have a sense of where the story may go. You don't necessarily know everything, right? It's documentary after all, it's not scripted. But you have a sense of who your characters will be and what your visual style will be. And you've really taken this past the ideation stage that you're now ready to start moving it into production. And that's what development funding is for. It's for a fully conceptualized project that wants funding to start to implement the process of making the film. And so it's important to know that because often I see projects where they think, and understandably, right, that development means give me money and I'll develop this idea. And no funder is going, right, they're in the enviable position that they don't have to do that. You have to be past the sort of basic idea of your project to be, bless you, ready to move on for you to be eligible for development funding. Right, I had a few more notes about Sundance. Okay, back to sobering reality. Sundance receives approximately 1,300 proposals each year, of which they fund 40 to 60, which again, and that's including American films. So that goes back to the 2 to 4%. They want feature-length documentaries, 52 minutes or longer. Hybrid, animated, experimental documentaries are also eligible. Sundance is really interested in people who are using cinematic language, right? They want films that really are cinema. And so that is a major criteria for what they fund. Sundance has several special funds that are now under, if you go to the Sundance Documentary Film Fund, you'll see that there are several additional funds listed. And these are relatively new funds. So the Candida Fund, the international projects that they accept are under a heading called People, Place, and Planet. And they say, here's what it says. The program seeks a world that embeds an understanding of the Earth's planetary boundaries into solutions for a more just and equitable society. It supports storytelling and storytellers that are exploring new ways to understand human relationship with the environment. And so that's really what they're looking for. Then the Loominatee Fund provides grants to filmmakers who are addressing their specific areas of interest, which are civic empowerment, data and digital rights, financial transparency, and independent media. Okay, this is sobering. They fund 6 projects a year, which seems to me criminal. Right? I mean, what's the point? But yeah, 6 lucky people. It's sort of like winning the lottery when it's 6 projects a year. Then there's one I didn't list, but since I've gotten funding from this one, I'll share this with you, which is called the Science Sandbox, which is for films that deal with science. And they support U.S. and international nonfiction projects, including feature-length films, shorts, series, immersive, and new media projects. So if you apply to Sundance, and actually one thing to know about Sundance is in the past year, they have opened up other opportunities beyond their funding opportunities. Sundance has labs. Many of you may know of these. There's an edit lab. There's now a creative producers lab. There is nonfiction sort of creative storytelling labs. And it used to be that you could only apply to those if you were funded by Sundance, any of these programs. Now you can apply to those independent of the funding, which is an incredible opportunity. And I was a creative producer fellow 2 years ago, and let me tell you, it is quite a lush setup at Sundance. They bring you out to Utah, and then they are really trying to make opportunities for you to meet with potential funders, but then there are workshops, you meet a community of filmmakers. It's a really incredible opportunity. The two directors I worked with on the Mudflow Grit film, they went to the edit lab. They were given a trailer for an entire week, and they and their editor stayed in the trailer, worked all day on their film, and had master editors who came in throughout the day to help them. And then at night, everybody shared work with each other, and it really is to create a community. But they're very intense weeks, but filmmakers from all over the world are welcome to apply. And once you are within the Sundance family, it is very separate from the festival, by the way. It doesn't mean that you have a better shot at the festival, but you do have relationships. But once you're in the sort of Sundance orbit, you're on their radar screen, you are then considered an alumna or an alumni, and you get invited to other things. There are programs. You get discounts if you go to the festival. So things to consider. Okay, next, the Tribeca Film Institute, TFI. They support documentaries from all over the world, but specifically in production and post-production. Their grants range from $25,000 to $50,000. And again, Tribeca, they have programs to support filmmakers. So if you are funded by them, there are other opportunities that come with them. They have networking days during the film festival. It gives you an opportunity to come to New York, which still, I love Amsterdam, but New York is definitely the greatest city on earth. I mean, let's just say that out loud. Even though I must confess, we did produce Donald Trump, which shames me to no end, but yeah, I think we're going to renounce his citizenship from New York soon. Okay, so Tribeca, another player in the field. Chicken and egg, they're here with us, amongst us. I don't see any chicken and eggers in the room, but I've run into them. So Chicken and Egg is specifically for women filmmakers. They're very interested in international projects. Their main program is for first and second time filmmakers of feature-length documentaries. So they give $35,000 towards your project, but the thing to know is that the main thing that they give you, money is obviously nice, is mentorship. And a part of being accepted into their what's called the Accelerator Lab is that you then are getting serious mentorship throughout the year. There are 3 entire weeks of retreats. So in fact, one of those weeks is here at IDFA, another is at Sheffield, and then the third is at the most extraordinary resort in upstate New York called Mohonk. I just went there as a consultant to another program, and it is mind-boggling. It's worth getting in just to be able to go to Mohonk for a week. But it is required by Chicken and Egg that if you accept their funding, that you have to participate in all of those programs. They have monthly calls, and they really are there trying to open doors for you. It's a very hands-on program where they really are looking to introduce you to funders in a very one-on-one way, and really to sort of support you both in terms of your project, but they're really looking for career sustainability and trying to help you think about this project in terms of an entire career. Because it's, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, this is a very tough field. Sustainability is really hard. And one thing I recommend to everyone, and I'm producing a film now, and the filmmaker had the good sense to do this, is that you either marry an editor or a funder. And so she had the good sense to marry an editor. I don't know if everybody's seen the film Knock Down the House, the film about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It took the states by storm. It was the film that Netflix paid $10 million for last year. And that filmmaker, Rachel Lears, who's a wonderful person, she married an editor too. So it's something to consider. Okay. The last, oh no, two more. So this is a funder that most of you probably have not heard of. This is the San Francisco, that's what SF is, San Francisco Documentary Film Fund. No, the Film Society of San Francisco, Film Fund. And this is a funder. Oh, Chicken and Egg has a $35 application fee, just to know. And the San Francisco Film Society also has, you have to be a member, which is $25, or the late deadline, $45. Films have to be feature length, 60 minutes or more. And they're looking for films that are in post-production. And they are very interested, again, in cinematic films. And let's see, no other notes about them. Okay, their funds are about $25,000, and like the rest of them, they're just a handful of them, but it's one that does take international projects, and very few people outside of the US know about them, so that's one worth considering. Okay, last two funds, and then we're going to start getting into the grant writing and the specifics of that. I mentioned earlier that one of the fiscal sponsors that you can consider for international projects is the IDA, the International Documentary Association, whose URL is documentary.org. And they have two funds. One is called the Père Lorentz, and anybody who knows their documentary history knows that Père Lorentz was an early documentary filmmaker in the US during the Depression who made films that were very political in nature. And so every year Père Lorentz has a fund, and they try, your film has to somehow talk about how you are furthering the inspiration left by Père Lorentz. So it sort of means watching his films, which are quite wonderful. And then every year they have a different subject that have supplemental questions that relate to Père Lorentz. So this year it was about economic justice. Last year it was about water rights. So they're completely random. It's hard to know. And yeah, for the same film, I was like, we applied twice. We were finalists both times. We didn't get it. But I can find a way to talk about water or about economic justice. It's part of what you do as a grant writer, is you can figure out how to spin anything any way. And that's a skill we're going to get to in a few minutes. And so for both of these, the applicant doesn't need to be a U.S. citizen, but what did they say? The primary applicant does need to be a permanent US citizen or resident, so that you need to partner with somebody. So it can be a project outside of the US, but you do need to have a primary applicant who is American. So yeah, here's a case for marrying American. But there are, even here at IDFA, there are lots of Americans. I can't tell you how many of my colleagues from home I've run into. So these are places to meet, to broaden your network, right? And not necessarily to propose to them, but to talk to people about co-producing. A lot of people, right, there are lots of roundtables about co-producing. So these are the kinds of places where it's good to build your network. And funding is very limited in the States, so we're also looking to co-produce. You, in Europe at least, have access to state funds that we don't have. So those are things, it's like both sides of the aisle are looking for funding opportunities. So these are the kinds of places, and it's great that you're all here, because this is where you're building your networks that will serve you, as I hope I've made clear, throughout your careers. Okay, so now we're going to go on. Oh, no. Okay, we're going to get to grants in a minute. So actually, this is a segue to grants. So one of the things that you have to consider when you are applying for a fund, or when you're talking to a broadcaster, is that you have to make sure that you're a good fit, right? We're all inside the fishbowl, right? We know that the rent is due, and that our partner is about to leave us because we haven't been able to earn enough money to pay our share of the rent, and that our credit card bill is due, and and that there's a shoot that is about to happen in 3 months, and if we don't cover it, right, we've missed a huge opportunity. So we're in the fishbowl knowing what all of our needs are, and we need the money, we need now. But funders, right, they're outside the fishbowl looking in, right? And they don't particularly care about all of the things that are going on for you. What they need to know is whether you have a project that is going to further their mission, that is going to serve them, right? And so our responsibility is to step outside of the fishbowl and to see the world from their perspective. So every funder has a mission. So, I think people have the impression, right, you're a funder and you go around the world looking for the best projects that are out there. And that is actually not what a funder does. A funder has a very specific mission statement, and what they're looking for are films that are advancing that mission. And that's why when I said earlier, I may see a project that I think is phenomenal, but it may not fit within the parameters of the mission of the fund that I'm working with. And that's when I will tell a colleague, hey, I saw this great project. It didn't work for us, but it may work for you. So it is imperative. There's a lot of work that you have to do when you're applying for grant funding to be able to know whether you are going to be a good fit for a given funder. And so knowing their mission statement is probably the most important thing, and looking at who they've funded to get a sense of what they're funding is probably the most important research you can do. Because what you're trying to do with your grant application is make the case why you're a good fit, right? You know those cat videos where there's a cat that jumps into a small box and it doesn't fit. And then you replace that box with an even smaller box and the cat will still jump into it. And often when I'm on grant funding panels, I see filmmakers who are doing the same kind of thing. So for example, I worked for Abby Disney, like Disney, and she had a film fund. She has a film fund. It used to be an open film fund. Now it's by invitation only. But it was a film fund that supported women filmmakers. And one year I was reading proposals for them, and there was a friend of mine actually, who was making the case that his film was about women and therefore was a perfect fit for the fund. And, you know, he looked like this cat, right? It was a fund for women, and it just made him look foolish. So you really want to start by knowing that you are a good fit. And again, it goes back to the strategy question, right? We have limited time, and therefore we want to use it to where we're going to most likely serve ourselves and move our projects forward and not just spin our wheels. Right? No matter how much you want the funding, if your project doesn't fit the mission, you're like her. Okay. So your proposal is your opportunity to make the case as to why you're a good fit. So now we're going to get into the actual specifics of grant writing. So I want to take a little break and ask, does anybody have any questions? Is anything not clear? Yes.
In the grants that you mentioned, is the first one the only one that's a development grant? And Sundance, of course, or do all of them have a development portion?
Well, Catapult is specifically, I would say, development, right, because it's funding your trailer. So that's development. But no, I think the others, either they give you funding or they don't. And most funders are looking to be more towards production or post-production because it's less risk for them, right? Because then they have a better sense that you're going to get over the finish line. So, yeah, development funds are hard to find. Oh, though I don't know whether you'd have to check, but Impact Partners in the States now has a grant, and I don't know whether they fund internationally, but they have a new development fund, so that might be worth investigating. Okay. Yes. I think a mic is coming towards you.
Okay, I just want to double check.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm very sorry, I will pass you the mic after that. Just to double check, are all those grants eligible for non-US citizens, or do you need to have a partner which is from US?
No, only the last one.
Only the last one.
Only I specifically put the funds up that
sure,
are international.
Right. Okay, thank you so much.
Of course.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question about the language of the film. Since in Europe, we very often make films with some speak English-speaking characters and some European-speaking characters. Now, what's the situation if we want to get grants from the US? I mean, do you have to have all English-speaking? I mean, and how do they deal with it later? Is it subtitled, or I mean, I'm interested to know.
So, for example, the film that I showed, the second film with the great photo, it originally was called Mudflow, and then they changed the title to Grit, which is why I keep calling it Mudflow Grit. That film was shot in Indonesia. It is completely subtitled. It was on the POV series last month. So no, it's totally fine to have foreign language. That's not a problem. The application has to be in English, of course. But these are funders who are really interested in international projects. They're really looking for stories that can only be told by the people who have access to them outside of the US. You know, we're a very insular people, as you probably know, and these are funders who really are trying to expose American audiences to a wider array of stories internationally. So absolutely, that's definitely not a problem.
Yes, if you're lucky enough to win one of these grants, what are your obligations besides delivering on the film? Are there any deadlines to meet? And
very good question. Thank you for asking that. So I should have mentioned that, so I appreciate you raising that. So most of these funds have either annual deadlines or deadlines twice a year, and it's important to check their websites to find out when they have deadlines. One of the things the industry has done in the past year is they've created a universal application called the Common Core, because it was that we were spending all of our time writing each application for each funder. So they decided, sustainability is a question. I know there's a panel here at IDFA about filmmaker sustainability, and it's a real conversation in the States. And so one of the ways that the industry responded in the States is by creating this universal application that I believe every one of the funders that I mentioned accepts. But what they do is they often have supplemental questions that are specific to themselves. The thing that is unfair is that a lot of them, for example, they have the same questions, right? So it's the Common Core, it's the same set of questions, but often, like Tribeca will have the first 2 questions are 500 words, whereas the IDA Enterprise is 1,000 words. So it's not totally reinventing the wheel each time, but it is a huge time suck to have to, do the word count and stuff like that. In terms of the obligations, one of the reasons that I go for grant funding over every other kind of funding, including broadcasters, and now in the States, investors are becoming a very big thing, like impact partners, venture capital, is that when you get a grant, it is a charitable donation, and you own all of the rights to your film. So with the Mudflow film, we raised $871,000 all in grant funding because it was very important to me that the filmmakers have control of the rights when the film was done, because that's where they're going to recoup any money, right? And they're not really earning a living making the film. So while the odds are very stacked against us, right? It's very hard to secure this money. It does mean that you retain all of the rights. This is a charitable donation, and the only thing they require is that you credit them on the film. You will have deliverables. You'll sign a contract with them, but that's all your obligation. And that's why this is the kind of funding I think is the most important to secure. Okay, I saw one more question, and then we're going to go on because we have a lot. Okay, I see 2. As we still have a lot to cover.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the Sundance Creative Producer Lab. So how is the application as a producer? You apply with a project and you go with a director, or how does it work?
Well, right now there's an acknowledgement in the States that producers have not been recognized in the same way that directors have. And as a producer myself, damn right, we need to be recognized for our contribution and compensated as well. And so Sundance, in an effort to recognize that discrepancy, created the Creative Producers Lab, and it's to cultivate the next generation of producers. And so no, you don't go with the director, you go on your own. And you meet with other producers and you talk about the business side of filmmaking, which unfortunately is a major part of it. And without us, I think it's much harder. And a lot of us are our own producers. I'm my own producer at the moment. So yeah, so you should apply. Yes, okay, who was the last question? Okay.
The application has to be made for all the funds by directors and filmmakers or producers, or it doesn't matter?
It doesn't matter. Okay. Whoever's willing to do it is who should do it. And usually it's a collaboration, right? When I work with directors, right, first off, nobody wants to do this work. So whoever's willing to do it. But okay, so I'm going to make the case now. For me, writing my application is the first step in my artistic process. And I hope that now we're going to get to the grant writing. I'm really hoping by the end you'll see the value of doing this as an exercise in helping you clarify your ideas about your own film. Because if you think about it, right, when you're starting your project, you've got all these ideas, and what the discipline of writing a grant really makes you think through some of your early creative choices. And I find that until I've written my grant application, my first proposal, It's still just a theory in my mind. And every time I write a grant application, I move the project forward immeasurably. And obviously, my hope and goal is to raise the money. But even if I don't, my project always evolves in that process, because right now I have a call tomorrow morning with a collaborator. We're working on a major proposal, and I sent him a draft of a proposal, and he's like, okay, these things aren't clear. And so he's really forcing me to think through creative choices so that I can articulate my vision of the film, whether it's on paper or in an elevator pitch. Okay, so now let's get to how do you do that, right? So one thing I want to say is that writing a grant, it's an exercise in getting funding. It's not the same as making your art. And so I think a lot of people are sort of intimidated because they think, well, I don't yet know how the story is going to end, right? These aren't scripted films we're making. These are documentaries. But you have to have enough of an idea to have a sense. Do the characters have dramatic arcs? Do you have a sense of where the story is going, right? When I said earlier, they're investing in you as an artist, what they want to know is that you are driving this train forward and that you have a game plan. So one of the ways you show that is on paper. And like any art, right, the more you do it, the better you become at it. And as I said just a moment ago, right, even if you don't win, it will help move your project forward. It helps you clarify your ideas, and it does make it easier to talk about your project. Okay, one question that I think we fail to ask ourselves, right, we're in the fishbowl again. We know why our project matters to us, and it seems obvious, but one thing you really need to do is to step outside of the fishbowl and ask, why should someone else care about this project? There is, right, as you all know, think how many films are here at IDFA. We were just in New York last week, was Doc NYC. There were 300 films alone, right? Sundance, how many applications do they get for like 12 slots? How many films are submitted to IDFA for the handful of slots? There is no lack of great ideas and great projects out there. And so when you're on a funding panel, let's take it from the other side, right? When I'm on a funding panel, I'll often have 300 applications. We're going to fund between 10 and 15. So the process of getting from 300 down to the 10 or 15 we're going to fund is first you look at anybody who didn't submit a complete application, or like the man who applied to a fund for women, like those, right, quickly you get rid of, let's say, 25 right off the bat. So now you're still at 275, you're only funding between 10 and 15, and now you're going to rank them, right? You're going to read the proposal, you're going to look at the sample, and you're going to cut out half. So now let's say out of 275, we're down to about 135, right? We're still only funding between 10 and 15, and we're going to read them again, and we're going to cut them down in half, and we're down to, let's say, 65, and we'll do it one more time, and we're now down to the final 30. And we have now read these, like, we've gotten to the absolute cream of the crop. These are stunning projects. And in the best of all worlds, with full public funding, they would all be funded. But now we're in, I know it's hard to feel sorry for funders, but now we're in the unenviable position of looking for reasons not to fund, right? Because we've got 30 fantastically strong competitive projects, and we're only going to fund half of them. So at that point, you're really looking for reasons to get rid of projects. So here's a scenario. You guys get to vote for a minute. You're going to be funders for the next 60 seconds. I've got two projects, okay? They're both amazingly good. So one is my Joe Papp film, which my mother can tell you is a terrific film. And it is about a man who died 25 years ago, who was an enormous influence on the cultural landscape in the States, but he's deceased, and whether the film is made this year or next year, right, he's still going to be deceased. I have another film that is about, how about The Cave? Okay, The Cave, which is about this underground hospital in Syria while there is a war going on, right? And the war in Syria is an international crisis nobody has any idea how to solve. So one is what I'd call timely and relevant and possibly urgent, and one is what I'd call an evergreen. If it's made this year or next year, sort of, it'll still be good. Okay, so we're voting. We can only fund one. Who's going for the evergreen? There are two people who raised their hands. Okay, who's going for the timely and urgent? And hands down, every time the funder is going to go with the timely and urgent. So if I'm doing a film about dead butterflies, I will find a way, without lying, you never lie, of emphasizing how timely and urgent this project is now, right? I'm always strategically thinking, I'm in the final pool. How do I make sure that when they're weighing my project with another really competitive project, that mine is the project they're going to fund? Asking why somebody should care about this project is a critical question, and you can't just assume because it's important to you, it's obvious to funders who are looking at, you know, every day, that's what their job is looking at projects and seeing so many good projects. Okay, here's another production still from the Grit and Mudflow film. And one of the things, we pitched this film at Hot Docs, and when we were pitching, Cynthia Wade, one of the filmmakers I was working with, said, I want us to bring people into a world with our pitch. And that has stayed with me, right? When I see a good film, it brings me into a world, right? It takes me into a universe, someone else's experience that I would not access otherwise. And when I'm writing a proposal, part of my goal is to bring somebody into a world, to describe it in vivid, visual terms, to make characters who are flesh and blood and dimensional, so that when I read it, I can imagine if I saw your character on the street, I would recognize them because you've described them in such detail that I could imagine them existing. And we're going to now get into the specifics of how to do this. I'm just sort of setting the stage of overall goals. So here are 3 questions that every grant application must answer, right? Why this project, right? Why should I care, essentially? Why are you the person telling this story? And why do we need this story now? Right, those are 3 key questions that you must answer. There are 7 components of almost every application. This is the Common Core, right? A project description, which is probably the most important. And we're going to go into a lot of this, particularly the project description. The personnel and credentials, right? Who is the team? The timeline. Now, here's something, seems absurd, but most people screw themselves on the timeline. So I was just on a panel in the States. We had 128 applications. 5 of them were disqualified on the timeline. So why, right? That seems insane. The timeline is asking you, from the time you submit the application until the funding award is announced. And unfortunately, I told you the positive side of grants, which is that you keep all the rights, right? That is a huge plus. The downside is that the deadlines are once or twice a year, and it can be 6 to 8 months before you find out. And therefore, you have to have projects that are going to take at least that amount of time to complete. So when people are writing their timeline, right, they say, okay, I've submitted my grant. I submitted a grant on July 23rd. I will not find out until April if I get funded, just to give you a house, which is true. This is a US grant. But your timeline starts right the day after, like what happens from the time you've submitted until the film is finished. But often filmmakers don't look at when the funding award will be announced and what the funding period is. Okay, so every fund says, we will fund you from the day we make the announcement for the next 6 months or for the next year. Usually it's a year. But if you say, right, I'm going to work, often people do, they'll say, okay, the grant was submitted in July, and I'm going to finish the film in time to apply for Sundance in January. But unfortunately, the grant award isn't going to be announced until April. So what you've told me in your timeline is that your film will be done before I make my grant announcement. So even if it's the best project I've ever seen in my whole life, you've been disqualified because you've told me that the film will be done before the grant period begins. So one of the most important things you need to do, it's a mere technicality, but it's a huge one, is whenever you decide to apply for a grant, the first thing you do is find out when the grant period begins and ends, and figure out whether your project will extend into the grant period, even if it's for just a few months. Because if it doesn't, then you're just wasting your time. So it's surprising how many people screw themselves in this very simple thing, but it's a technicality that's important to know. Okay, audience and distribution. Obviously, funders want to know that there is an audience for the work, right? That it's not just your partner and your friends who are going to go see it, that you have a credible distribution plan, fundraising plan, right? That if they give you $35,000 or $50,000 towards your project, that you have a credible plan for raising the rest of the money, right? They don't want to just give you money if they don't think you're going to be able to fully finance the rest of your budget. Then the budget, obviously, which we'll talk about, and the work samples. So a proposal is an overall story, and each of these 7 elements is telling a piece of that story. And we're going to go into how you do that, but you have to think of it as a total story that you're telling, and everything feeds and serves one major narrative. Okay, if you were an investor and you were looking to invest in a superhero action figure, and I came to you with this blueprint, right? This is my idea of a superhero action figure. And this is just, right, this is a blueprint. It's a piece of paper. It's a theory of an action hero. It's not the actual thing. But by looking at this, you have a good sense, if you were an investor, as to what you would get if you put your money into this project, right? And it would reveal, it would pull back the curtain on what my thinking is, right? To you, the investor, you would have a sense, have I thought this through? And you can see, like I've conceptualized it from different angles, I've looked at it from multi-perspectives, and by looking at this, even though this doesn't exist, you'd have a good idea what you would get if you were to invest in this. Metaphorically, right, your proposal is your blueprint. If I were an architect and you said, design the house of my dreams, and I presented you with this blueprint, right, you'd be able to look at this and know whether this fits the idea you have in mind. You'd know how high it is, how many bedrooms, you'd have a basic sense of what I have in mind. Right? Can you imagine this house existing in your mind's eye? That's what a good proposal does. It allows me to imagine, to see your project as I read it, and it comes off the screen. off the page, right? Remember before I was saying that I could imagine if I met your characters, I would recognize them based on the very multidimensional descriptions, vivid descriptions that you provided. And the thing to remember is that we're storytellers, and part of our proposal writing is showing our ability to tell a good story. So the most time we're going to spend between now and the end of this presentation is really talking about the project description, because that is the most important thing. That is really where a funder gets a sense of what you have in mind for your story, right? You are describing your distinctive vision, and you're highlighting any thematic qualities. So your project description should answer the following 3 questions, right? What makes it unique, obviously? Why a film? And this is an interesting question. And it goes back to something I said earlier about often I see an issue in search of a film. Often I read a proposal and I think to myself, why is this a film? Why is this not an article? Why is this not a radio piece, right? Why is this not a book? If you are making the case that you need to make a film, you have to use language that conveys a sense of it being visual, right? I need to be able to see it, to conjure it in my mind's eye. And I need to see it as a story, right, that has a specific character arc. And then part of that is describing your aesthetic approach, which we will go into in just a second. When I'm writing a proposal, I'm trying to strike a balance between what I call context, between the macro story, like the big universe in which the story lies, and the specific details as to how those big themes, those big broad brushstrokes, translate into a specific story. And I'm sure that's a lot to swallow, so we'll break that down a bit. This is a painting by one of my favorite painters. His name is Chuck Close. And for anybody who knows Chuck Close's work, he makes millions and millions of little boxes of paint that come together to create an overall picture. And context is the same thing. The big picture is the context. The little dots of paint are the bits of information that go into creating context. So if I were writing a proposal for Chuck Close, whose paintings sell for millions, tens of millions of dollars, so he actually doesn't need to write grant applications, but if he called me up and he said, Tracy, can you write a proposal for me? I'd say, Chuck, here's how I would suggest we frame this. I would talk about Chuck Close existing within the larger world of art history, going back to pointillism and people like Seurat and painters who use dots of paint, that he exists in a larger universe of work. And so I would situate what he does having a bigger, metaphorically, canvas, so that somebody would understand that he's now taking that history and translating it into modern terms. Okay, so what I think of when I'm writing my project description is an upside-down triangle where I create the context at the beginning. I try to frame the work, and since I'm thinking funder, I'm thinking what is going to hook the funder. So, for example, with the Mud Flow Grit film, that was a film that was about fracking, right? Drilling for natural gas. And at the time, that was a big issue in New York. We were about to decide whether New York was going to allow fracking to go forward. And so here I am making a film set in Indonesia for American funders, and I'm trying to build a bridge so that the American funders understand why this film is relevant to them. And so I wrote, at a time where fracking is headline news here in the US, here is a film that will help inform that debate, right? My job is to take somebody by the hand and to build the bridge so that they can see why it is relevant to them. And so that's what I'm trying to do is, at the beginning, what are the big themes, the big picture, and set the stage for that. And then, as the triangle narrows, my job is to translate those big themes into a specific narrative that has specific characters and plot points. And often, right, in the course of a proposal, you can't go into every detail, right? A proposal is not, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's big picture stuff. So I'll often introduce characters. I'll tell one or two anecdotes or describe scenes that illuminate the kind of issues or the dramatic tensions in the film. You don't have to tell everything. You just have to give enough of a sense, A, that you're in control, right, inspiring confidence, but to give me a sense of where the film is going. So one of the things that I do when I am, I'll give you a minute to read this quote. This is by Shireen Nashat, a very well-known Iranian artist. And this is how she describes her work. Actually, I'll just read it. Part of me has always resisted the Western cliched image of Muslim women, depicting them as nothing more than silent victims. My art, without denying repression, is a testimony to the unspoken female power and the continuing protest in Islamic culture. So by reading this, without even seeing her work, I already have a sense of where she's coming from, right? She's saying that she stands sort of at the intersection of challenging the very narrow image that we have in the West of Muslim women as, as just repressed victims. But she's also, as a Muslim woman from Iran, she also isn't denying the patriarchy of the religion. So even without seeing her work, she's pulled back the curtain. I now have a sense of how she approaches her art. It gives me a frame of reference. And your proposal is a continuous opportunity to pull back the curtain and to explain your thinking and how you're approaching your project. And remember what I said, they're buying into you as a person as much as to your project. So from the context, right, we're now narrowing in and describing the project. I got ahead of myself. This is what I had said a moment ago, right? And so you could do the triangle the regular way, right? You could start with the details and then broaden out to the context. But I do think it's important to strike a balance between the two. I like to start with the context because I think that the funders are more likely to get hooked by the big issues at the top rather than the details, but it could go either way. I do think it's important to have both. Okay. Some applications ask you for your artistic approach, your aesthetic approach. If they don't, in the project description, I make a subheading called stylistic approach, where I say this is a verite film, or this film will have no narration, or we have reenactments, or we're using archival footage. We're using sound, how we're using music. I will create some sense of what the aesthetic approach is, right? Again, showing that I'm making conscious choices and giving them a sense of what my thinking is stylistically. I'm working on a film now. I'm producing a film by a woman director. It's set in a town in West Virginia that has no Wi-Fi, cell phones, or microwaves. Hasn't since 1958. There are children growing up without ever having seen a cell phone. And one of the things we describe in the visual section is her use of sound. Because if people aren't always looking down at their phones, and there isn't a lot of technology, the quiet in this town is unlike anything. There's a woman who we have on camera, and she said she shakes her keys. And she said, where else in the world could you hear your keys? The filmmaker is trying to film through people's eyes what they see when they're not always looking at their phones. So we describe, right, we can't use wireless technology because, right, there's no Wi-Fi. So we describe how the limitations inform our filmmaking. Those are the kinds of details that reveal to a funder your thinking and the creative choices that you're making. One of the things that I always do, right, I told you there are two signatures. You know it's a proposal that I've written. One is, right, there's always urgency, relevance, timeliness, no matter what the subject. And I always start my proposals with a quote. So, for example, this is a quote from my Joe Papp film. This is Don Byron, who was the composer on my film. And right, you guys have never, I'm sure, never heard of Joe Papp. I'll give you a minute to read this quote. It'll give, I hope, give you a sense of who he was and what he did for this man. Right, so Joe Papp was the first person to open up theater and the arts in America to people of all races and colors in the 1950s, when theater was exclusively white and middle class. And his theater is really known as the place that is the most inclusive in the country, which is why Hamilton came out of the public theater. And so Don Byron, as a child, his mother took him to the public theater, and he, thought Shakespeare is highbrow, it's not for black people, and he goes and he sees people of color on both sides of the stage, and he realizes that Shakespeare and all culture is open to him. And so for me, a quote, and I'll show you one more, and then I'll tell you my thinking about quotes. So this is the quote I used to open the proposal for Mudflow. Right, fierce, with a blind rage, causing mud to gush and swallow anything that got in its way. Right, to me that was visceral. I was doing research, I had to read and learn about this tsunami of mud that was unleashed in East Java. And this was a quote from somebody I found in a newspaper, an online paper, but I thought that it captured sort of the force of the mud flow and what it must have felt like. And to me, quotes have a very strong, emotional hook. And I think, I'm of the generation who still likes going to see movies in cinemas. And if you think about it, when you go to see a movie, right, you're out in the world, you've just come from work, you're thinking, remember to get milk on the way home, and, I've got a meeting tomorrow, and you've got all this stuff on your mind. And then you sit down, and the lights go down, and the movie starts. And then 2 minutes in, there's a title sequence. And my theory is that the title sequence allows you to transition from the world that you've just come from with all the things going on in your life to say, forget about that. Right now, for the next 2 hours, we're going to have this magical experience in cinema. And to me, a quote does the same thing. So whoever is reading, right, 300 applications, and I've got 5 meetings, and I've got an hour to get through 80 applications, and I've got to get home, and, I've got all these things, and now I'm going to sit down and read these applications, and I'm totally distracted. And to me, a quote, sucks someone into the emotion of my project, and it sort of says, forget about whatever else is on your mind. Be in this moment, in this world that I'm trying to conjure for you. And so that's why I like quotes. I think they serve to do that. And I'm a nerd enough that I love doing the research. And so remember I said at the beginning, I wanted you to have a game plan, to leave here with a roadmap of how you start things. For me, searching for my quote, that's how I start. And it's fun because when you find the right quote, you know it. Okay, we don't have time to go into all of the sections because we're rapidly running out of time. But I just want to say about the personnel section, which we're not going to really cover, is if you are a first-time filmmaker, one thing to think to enhance your credibility in the field is to align yourself with people who have more experience. So when I made the Joe Papp film, it was my first feature doc, I approached Sam Pollard, who was Spike Lee's editor, and he was my editor. And the fact that Sam, right, nobody knew my name, but everybody knew Sam's name, and the fact that he was willing to work with me conferred legitimacy on me. So that is something that you might consider doing, is getting a consulting editor who's or a consulting producer, and by their association with your project, you further legitimate yourself. With the audience and distribution section, something that we said earlier is that you're trying to show, right, if a funder is putting money into your project, they want to know that it's going to reach an audience, and they want to know that you've thought about, right, what happens when it's done. And so one thing you can do is you can get a letter of support from a potential distributor, a potential funder, a broadcaster. It doesn't have to be a letter of commitment. It can be a letter of interest. So for many years, I worked as a consultant to Women Make Movies. We would often have, which is a distributor of films by and about women, and often we would have filmmakers who would approach us, is this a film that you might consider distributing? And if it was a film we were interested in, we would write a letter saying, you know, this film sounds very promising, it would perfectly fit within our catalog, and we would then give them a letter of interest that they could then attach to their application. Now, more and more applications are being submitted online where, like, they have specific word counts and you can't attach an additional, like, letter of commitment. In those situations, what I do is I'll take a quote from the letter and I'll incorporate it into my proposal somehow so that I let it serve me. If you're doing a film that is a social issue film, let's think of a social issue film. There was a film in the United States about the role of women on the front lines of combat during the Iraq and Afghanistan war. At the time, it was illegal by US law for women to serve on the front lines. But here was a film that showed the women, right? We were so overextended, having needless wars in not one but two countries, that our military was overextended. So there were women in the military who were coming back from these wars, who were suffering from PTSD and all of the other, you know, conditions that men were suffering from, but they weren't eligible for the same benefits because, according to US law, they weren't there. Here was a film that showed that women were there. So there were all of these organizations of women military personnel and veterans who knew this unjust situation, but they didn't have a vehicle, a way to make this issue prominent. This film gave them that opportunity. So the filmmakers went and partnered with all of these women veterans, and these women veterans talked about the injustice and how this film was going to serve their interests, right? It was going to help them give this issue visibility. Well, and so that's the kind of a letter of support that shows that there is a need for this film. This film is going to be used by organizations. It's going to make a difference. When the film came out, these organizations worked with the filmmakers. They organized a screen before the US Senate. I guess the Senate, maybe it was the House military, I don't know which committee it was, but it was some important committee dealing with military affairs. And overnight, the laws changed, right? If you're a funder, that's an incredible impact. Not every film is an issue film, and not every film is, that's what I call an action film, where there's a specific thing. But if you can get letters of support saying how this project will further or be of benefit to an organization or to a community group or a cultural institution, right? Think about it, we're down to 2 equally good films, one that has a letter of support or a commitment or a letter of interest from a broadcaster and one that doesn't, right? They're equally good, you're going to go with the one that does. That's true for, in terms of funding, it's true for audience distribution. Okay. Crowdfunding, and this may be changing, but I heard the president of the Ford Foundation, a major funder in the US, say that he loves films that are funded through crowdfunding. And I was like, really? Why? He said because it shows there's an audience for your film. And I thought that was really interesting. So I was working last year with a filmmaker from South America, and she had created a Facebook page for her film. She had 46,000 followers. That's the kind of thing that I would put in an audience and distribution section saying, even though we're still in production, already we know there is an audience for this film. Here's the proof, right? 46,000 people, the film isn't done. That's powerful. Earlier, I talked about Josh Fox's film, Gasland. When we did the distribution section for Mudflow Grit, we talked about, we knew there was a huge audience for the film based on the success of Mudflow, right? It's again, you're building bridges, you're trying to show the logic behind your thinking, right? You're pulling back the curtain so a funder knows what your thinking is. Okay, we're in the home stretch, folks. You guys have been very, very patient, and I know I'm just throwing a lot at you. So this is how I described the distribution for the Joe Papp film. And if you read this, what you'll notice is that I emphasized not that it was going to reach millions of individuals and be streaming. I focused on PBS, classrooms, libraries, community groups, and then digital download. And the reason I did that was that my funders were social issue funders. And they cared that this was going to reach public television audience and community groups and educators. They didn't care about like a commercial audience like a Netflix. So I'm thinking strategically, who is my funder? What's going to resonate for my funder? Okay, fundraising plan, the same thing, credibility. Everything we're doing is about credibility. And so often I see in proposals, people list every film funder under the sun. But that is not strategic because often I know if somebody listed the Ford Foundation and they're doing a film that is an art film, I know Ford only funds social issue films. And therefore, I know that you don't know what Ford funds. So you can undermine your credibility by listing funders that are not likely to fund you. So I think people often think like showing a long list will impress me. But every funder reading this, it's a finite number of funders out there, film funders, and people know, people who are reading this, right, this is what they do for a living, they know who funds what, and so you have to be careful to only list funders that are likely to work for your project. Okay, budget, this is, this and work sample. Any budget can work. Right? It's not that there are budgets that are too high or too low. It's again the logic. So I mentioned that we raised $871,000 for the Mudflow film. Nobody questioned that budget. That is a very high budget. Everybody will agree that's a high budget. But the filmmakers went to Indonesia 8 times. They interviewed the Donald Trump of Indonesia. And believe it or not, we had to get something called kidnapping insurance, and they had to have security. Those were expensive items. And so the fact that we could explain to a funder why we had a high budget, not one funder questioned the budget, right? There was an organic logic, and we were transparent about it. On the other hand, I have a colleague in New York, one of the most famous documentary filmmakers of all times, And she's working on a film right now that is using her family's home movies and oral history. And she's making it, she's in Brooklyn, she's making it from her apartment, and her budget is over $1 million. Exactly. Right? I'm like, really? Why? Why is that $1 million? And she is standing on principle saying she should be paid for all of the years she's working on this project. And in theory, I agree with her. But that's not the terms of the industry we work in. We don't get paid adequately for our work, and therefore, standing on principle means that she just looks foolish, right? But on the other hand, budgets that are too low, when I see budgets that are really low, like $80,000 for a feature film, I know a couple of things. I know that the filmmaker isn't getting paid, so I think it's a hobby and not an avocation. I know that you're not working with a top editor, right? So it's information. Now, if you took my advice and you married your editor, and therefore you could make your film less expensively because your editor wanted to keep you happy in your marriage and was doing this, for cheap, then your budget could be low, but I would need to know the logic behind it. So that's why I keep saying, right, you're trying to pull back the curtain and you're trying to give as much, your proposal is an opportunity to explain the logic behind what you're doing. Right, include fees for yourself, I think that's very important. Okay, sample works, they need to contextualize, right? What you say in the proposal has to be complementary to what I see in the sample work. They can't be the same thing, but you also can't tell me this is going to be a visually compelling, sumptuous piece of cinema and then show me a sample with poor sound that looks crummy. And you have to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. And again, it's so competitive. People often say to me, this isn't what my final film is going to look like. Whatever you submit is the only thing they know. And because it's such a competitive universe out there, if your sample isn't competitive, you can't say to them, look, I know it's going to be beautiful, trust me. They're not going to do that, right? If it's between you and someone else who has a sample that really is a proof of concept of what they intend, then, right, you're between two, they're going to go with that one. You can't explain, like, we will use good sound, please trust me on it. Whatever they see is what they're going to take as representative of your work. Okay, final points. This is a Banksy. This is the elephant in the room. These are the questions you hope the funder will not be thinking about. So, for example, are there similar projects, right? Think how many films there are about Syria, about the refugee crisis. In the States, it's about immigration and the border crisis. Pretending that you're not aware that there are other films on your subject and not addressing that point does not serve you well. What you want to do is anticipate any questions a funder may have, and you want to provide an answer, right? We know there are many great films right now about the war in Syria, but here is an angle that has yet to be looked at, right? Think about The Cave. Right? That was a film about a subject that's been covered in lots of films. It was an unusual look at it. The Mudflow film, our budget was insanely high. We knew that would be a question. We explained the logic behind that. Anytime you do that, right, you don't want them to fill in the blank. You want to fill in the blank. That's what I call the elephant in the room, right? Okay, conclusions. Think of the sample and the proposal as two parts of a whole. They're complementary. Every element in the proposal should feed an overall narrative. Make me see in my mind's eye what you have in mind. And one thing I often do, and this might be a good way to start if you decide you want to go down this road, is I try to write a review as if the film were finished. Right? If you think about what a review is, it's a distillation, right? It doesn't say, and then this happened and this happened. It doesn't go into the weeds. It gives you a broad overview, a few plot points, a sense of the overall story, introduction to some characters, but major themes. And that, like I reverse engineer by trying to imagine that magic moment. The film has just premiered here at IDFA. Next day we're reading the reviews in the press. What does it say? And that is often a way to start writing a proposal. Right? Anticipate any questions, remove any red flags prophylactically, right? Anticipate those. Okay, and I will leave you now with my filmmaker's toast, and then we'll have maybe 5 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, I know there's a lot to cover, and we don't have as much time for questions as I had hoped. But here is my toast. May the funding flow like wine, and may the rights holders give freely. So in our last remaining messages, if you're still conscious or realizing that you need to find a producer who can write, those are legitimate things. But yes, so I see a question here.
Are there any resources that have maybe case studies of successful documentary core applications and the reviews that a funding agency or a producer might have written on them internally? Yeah. Is there something?
Right, that is a really fair question. It's very hard to find successful applications to have access to them. I believe that ITVS, which does only fund US filmmakers, has sample applications, which would be itvs.org. And then another US funder that has samples but only funds US is the National Endowment for the Arts, which is NEA.gov, G-O-V, because it's government. And if you go to their media section, they have short samples of the different kinds of things, so that would give you a sense. But one thing I really encourage you all to do is to start building communities. You know, a number of the people in the audience had been at Leipzig together. And you have your network of filmmakers. Like, one of the things, it is hard to earn a living, as we all know, doing this work. But what we do have is we're a community, and we're very generous, and we share resources with each other. And so for example, I belong to a group of 13 women filmmakers called the Film Witches. We would read each other's proposals and give each other feedback because, right, we're in the fishbowl. So one thing I really encourage you to do is to share your proposals with fellow filmmakers and make sure what you think you're conveying is coming through, right? I just sent, as I said, a draft proposal to a colleague, and he's like, I'm overwhelmed and confused. And I thought, okay, I wasn't. But so it's, you know, it really, really is helpful to form communities. Often I do workshops where people work over 5 weeks on a proposal, and they then meet alternative weeks and read their proposals among themselves. So those are the kinds of things that I think are really invaluable. It's very isolating to make films, and so finding a way to be part of a community really helps. Anyone else have any questions? Yes. So the question was, when you're applying, does it make sense to show part of a previous work? And actually, I didn't cover that, so thanks for raising that. Almost every application asks for a previous work, so you are required, which is why with first-time filmmakers, you need to partner with somebody who has experience, because almost always you have to have a previously completed work in addition to the sample of the current work. So the bar for entry is high. Okay. So the question was, if you have gone to filmmaking school and have some kind of credential, or you were working as an artist, I think that these days so many people don't go to film school just because the expense is so insane, that I think it really is in the work itself. Like, that's really what's going to be the proof of your abilities. But if you have life experience, if you've been in a previous career, and that has relevance on the subject of the film. So I worked with a filmmaker who was probably in her mid-40s, who had been a corrections officer, worked in the prison system within the United States. She's African American, and she was making a film called The Talk with her 13-year-old son about policing in the States. But the fact that she had worked in the criminal justice system gave her experience that nobody else would have. So in that case, it was relevant. So that's what I would say. I think we have time for one more question. And I see somebody all the way in the back.
Hello.
Hi.
It was a budget question.
Sure.
What's an acceptable amount to put in for yourself? Obviously, it's a big question, but
Right.
you know, you might invest 2 years, 3 years of your
Absolutely.
time. How do you break it down?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It's a hard one to answer. You know, I will say that budgets in Europe are entirely different than budgets in the States, which always surprises me. Budgets in Europe are a fraction of what they are in the States, which I don't fully understand. But so in the States, I would say $70,000 for a producer-director is a reasonable amount. But the truth is, right, it's not that you can say, I'm going to get that for the 2 to 3 to 5 years it's going to take me. It's that amount once. And so, right, and often what happens is that, let's say you get a grant, like the filmmaker I'm working with on the film In the Town Without Wi-Fi, like we've raised significant money. She's not paying herself because she wants to use the money for the film. But the fact that it's there, she is entitled to that. And so if at any point she needs it, she can. But I know for myself, it's the same thing. Like, you usually have such little money that you end up giving the money to the project to move it forward. But I do think it's imperative to put that in, to say to the industry, we are working people. What we do is we make films. Just as you get compensated for your job as the film funder at Sundance or at Tribeca, and you get paid vacation and benefits, like, that's important that we be recognized. So you may not get it, but I do think it's important to put it in. Okay, so we've run out of time. Thank you very much for your patience, and I wish you all full funding. Thank you.